Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to start the second chapter that is called Pollination and Fertilization. It is on page 38 of your textbook. Now, what is pollination? The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma is called pollination. What are pollen grains? The male part of the flower, and stigma is the female part of the flower. Now there are three different ways in this process takes place. The first one is called autogamy. Now what is autogamy? When the pollen of the same flower falls on the stigma of the same flower. That is, within the same flower this pollination is taking place. That is, the pollen of the same flower falling on the stigma of the same flower. What is it called? Autogamy. The second one is called geitonogamy. And in what happens in this is that pollen of one flower falls on the stigma of a flower which is on the same plant. Not the same flower, but a flower of the same plant. So it's called geitonogamy. Then you go, the third one is known as allogamy. Now what is allogamy? When the pollen of the flower of another plant of the same species falls on the stigma of another plant, totally another plant, not the same plant but on another plant, but the species is the same. That means from the hibiscus the pollen grain is falling from the hibiscus of one flower to the stigma of another flower which is of the same species, that is of the hibiscus plant only. Then it is known as allogamy. So here we have studied the three types of pollination: autogamy, geitonogamy and allogamy. Now when does pollination occur? Pollination occurs between plants of the same species. Okay, pollination generally occurs between plants of the same species. The stigma receives the pollen grains of different species of the plants. That is, the pollen grains can fall on different stigmas of different plants. Okay, but only the pollen of the same species will continue the process of reproduction. But only if the pollen grain falls on the stigma of the same type of plant, okay, on the same species, then only the reproduction will go on further. Otherwise what will happen to the pollen grain is they will die, okay, they will perish, okay, and germination will not take place, okay, because after pollination the next process is germination, so it does not continue with the process of germination. Now we come to self-pollination. Now what is self-pollination? The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. That is autogamy, as we studied before, or to the stigma of another flower of the same plant, that is geitonogamy. So when these two take place, it is known as self-pollination. Now, when does self-pollination takes place? Okay, what are the factors required, or when does self-pollination take place? Number one, when the flowers are bisexual. What is bisexual? When both the male and the female flowers are born on the same plant, on the same flower. Okay, the same flower is having both the male and the female parts of the plant. Second part is when they are unisexual flowers, okay, or even when the male and the female flowers are different but they are born on the same plant, okay, please note, on the same plant, then also this type of pollination, that is self-pollination, can take place. The third situation is homogamy. Now what is homogamy? When the anther and the stigma mature at the same time. Okay, you know, for pollination the anther and the stigma should mature at the same time. So that is known as homogamy. The fourth part is known as cleistogamy, when the anthers and the stigma lie very close to each other and they mature at the same time. Okay, cleistogamy means very close to each other. Okay, and some of the flowers do not open at all. Okay, the petals don't open at all. So there is no other way. Okay, there is no other way the flowers can be pollinated except by self-pollination. Okay, so the example is the pansy flowers which are found closer to the ground. They do not open at all. Okay, when they do not open at all, this situation is known as cleistogamy. Now moving on to the advantages of self-pollination. Now what are the advantages? Number one, it is a surer method in bisexual flowers. When the flowers are bisexual, that is both male and female are found in the same flower, then this is a very sure method, okay, that the pollination will take place. Second part is the parental characters are preserved, parental characters are preserved. Okay, so whatever are the characters of the parent plant, it will continue in the daughter plant. No wastage of pollen grains. Okay, hardly any pollen grains will be wasted because they'll be not thrown out into the air or into the water or any other method. Flowers need not be large and showy. Now for the other type of cross pollination, the flowers have to be large and colorful and bright and all that. So in this case, for self pollination, the flowers need not be large and colorful. Scent and nectar need not be produced because they are not being pollinated by insects. So they need not produce scent and nectar. Now when they do not produce scent and nectar, they need not be large and colorful. What happens? The nutrient material in the plant gets saved. Okay, there is no need of producing the scent, the nectar, the color, and etc, etc. So what happens? It becomes a greater economy for the plant because it does not have to produce these extra nutrient material. Now what are the disadvantages of self-pollination? Number one, weakening of the variety. Okay, now the offsprings that are produced become less vigorous. Okay, they are not that vigorous or active like the active or real, not that good a variety, okay, as the other pollinated flowers. Number two, defective or weaker characters cannot be eliminated. Now if there is any defect in the parent plant, it cannot be eliminated. The daughter plant will also have the same weakened or the defective characters. Does not yield new variety. You can never get a new variety from the self-pollinated flowers. Genetic traits are passed to the next generation. Whatever is the genetic trait of the parent, genetic trait you mean whatever the characteristics of the parent are then given to the offspring plant. Now we move on to the second type of pollination, which is known as cross-pollination. What is cross-pollination? It is a transfer of pollen from the anthers of the flowers of one plant to the stigma of a flower of another plant of the same species. Now what are the advantages of cross-pollination? Number one, you get healthier offsprings compared to self-pollination. The offsprings are healthier because these are the pollen grains are from the different plant and the stigma is from the different plant. The seeds are abundant and viable. Okay, there are more seeds and more seeds are produced and they are viable, means they are more healthier. New varieties are produced. Even you can get new variety by cross pollination. Now what are the disadvantages of cross pollination? The pollination is not always certain. It is not necessary that cross pollination will take place. Okay, so it is not always certain. Number two, there is a wastage of pollen grain. This pollen grain can be transferred by wind or insects. Sometimes the pollen grains stick to the body of the insects, as we have seen last year. Lot of pollen grains get wasted. Likewise, by wind pollination also, they are thrown away by the wind, so they get wasted. This wastage takes place in cross pollination. Third type is uneconomical method. Because of this wastage, it is considered as an uneconomical method of pollination. Now what are the factors which favor the cross pollination? What helps in cross pollination? First part is unisexuality. Because the male and the female parts are on different plants, this is the only method by which the flowers can undergo pollination. So that is the advantage, because that is one of the factors which favor the cross pollination. Number two, dichogamy. What is dichogamy? When the male and the female, that is the androecium and the gynoecium, they mature at different times. Okay, the androecium matures at different time, gynoecium matures at a different time. Now there are two important terms regarding this. The first one is known as protandry. Now what is protandry? The anthers mature earlier than the stigma. That means the male part is maturing earlier than the stigma. What is the condition called? It's called protandry. Now what are the examples? Bhindi, sweet pea, salvia and sunflower. Okay, now make a note of this. These are the plants that undergo protandry. That is the male part anther maturing earlier than the stigma. The second one is protogyny. Now what is protogyny? When the stigma matures earlier than the anther. It is just the opposite of protandry. In protandry, it was the male maturing early. Protogyny is the stigma maturing earlier than the anther. Example, custard apple and people. Now self-sterility. Even if the stigma receives the pollen from the anthers of the same flower, the pollens fail to germinate. Now sometimes what happens, the stigma, receives the pollen grains, but because of some reason, these pollen grains, they do not germinate. Okay, they do not germinate, they do not fuse. Okay, so this pollen from another plant can complete the process. Only pollen from some other plant can complete the process. Now example is the ray florets of the sunflower or the orchids. As I shown you before, the ray florets of the sunflower, they are the neuter flowers. Okay, they fail to germinate. Okay, so that's an example of self-sterility. Okay, it has become sterile. It is unable to undergo the process of reproduction. Hercogamy, the pollen of the flower cannot reach the stigma of the same flower. Okay, so that is a mechanical barrier. By some reason, the pollen is unable to reach the stigma. Example, the hood covering the stigma in the pansy flower. Okay, if you Google it, you will find the hood covering the pansy. Okay, the stigma of the pansy flower, which does not help. It is like a mechanical barrier. It stops the pollen grains from reaching the stigma. Now heterostyly, when the stigma and the anthers grow at different heights. Okay, now for pollination to take place, the stigma and the anther should be more or less at the same height. But in this case, the stigma and the anther grow at different heights. Okay, one is higher, one is lower. So in this case also, the self-pollination will not take place. Okay, so the example is primrose and oxalis. So these are the conditions. So students, hope you have understood the two topics that we have covered today, that is self-pollination and cross-pollination. And if you have any doubts or any queries regarding these two topics, you may put it into the comment box with your name and your division. Thank you.